good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's special 50th Earth Day presentation. My name is Dawn Sheriffs. I'm the Florida Director for the Environmental Defense Fund, who, along with our partners at the University of South Florida, are very, very excited to host all of you in this conversation with our special guests today. Just a couple of housekeeping items. So we are recording the webinar, so the entire webinar will be shared with you via email a couple of days after the event. So make a watch for your email for that notification. We will certainly be having an opportunity for questions after each speaker rather than waiting until the end. And so the way that you can submit your questions is through the Q&A feature on the bottom. Attendees don't have any other sort of way to communicate with us. So please feel free to submit your questions through Q&A and we will get to as many of them as we can. So today's conversation is, coming at a time where all of us are really facing unforeseen challenges about how we keep our families safe. And it's hard to focus a little bit on how far we've come in the last 50 years and how far we have to go. So what we're going to do today is hear from many, many experts about what we're learning from science about Florida's future in our changing climate and discuss both the implications and the opportunities for protecting our future. I am especially excited to welcome Congressman Vern Buchanan, who has represented one of the most sea level rise vulnerable communities in Florida since 2006. Congressman Buchanan understands the impacts of a changing climate to our health and economy and is a champion on finding ways to spur innovation in clean energy technology. Congressman, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and I want to thank EDF and USF and their effort to protect the environment. Florida is home to the nation's greatest treasures and natural resources. I'm committed to protecting our environment and wildlife. Let me touch on just a couple of two or three things, and then I'll be glad to take anybody's questions or comments. As a kid growing up outside of Detroit in Lake Erie, I remember Lake Erie was so polluted you couldn't fish or swim in it. If you caught a fish, you couldn't eat it because of mercury content. So that's very much in the front of my mind, because I think one of the top issues we're facing, there's a lot of multiple issues, but it's the whole thing on water qualities relates to Florida because of a peninsula. I'm in Sarasota up to, Tampa Bay area, and I can tell you there's nothing in my mind more important than that. We lose that, we lose everything. So water quality, as I mentioned, is key to Florida. I've worked on securing $8 million in research money for Red Tide, co-sponsored Save Our Seas 2.0, that act to address the growing problems with marine debris polluting our oceans. Also have co-sponsored legislation to address ocean acidification. I was also one of 34 members to vote for funding to protect our coastal communities from climate change. Also, when I came to Congress many years ago, one of the big things, primarily in our party, but I would just say just in general, and I heard it, living on the coastline, is this concept of drill, baby, drill. And they were even talking about back then drilling 3 miles off our coastline, which is a thing I stood strong on because, people might feel differently in Texas or let's say Louisiana, but on our shore, I wanted to make sure I stood in the gap and defended that. But Monday was the 10th anniversary of Deepwater Horizon disaster. I still have that vividly in my mind of what it does, not just to the environment, but to the economy. It was a disaster for us. Should serve as a reminder that we cannot take risks that damage our environment and the economy. I oppose drilling off the coast of Florida. That's been clearly my record for the last 10 plus years. And as first of anybody, the first Earth Day was founded in 1970 after an oil spill off the California coast. Also, the other point I wanted to make is on climate change. There's no question in my mind it's a serious threat to the Suncoast and the rest of Florida, which has 2 coastlines that are at risk of rising waters. According to a study in Manatee County is at the most at-risk county in the entire country in terms of potential damage caused by climate change. The Pentagon has even stated that climate change is a national security threat. That's why I'm one of only 3 Republicans to support legislation to keep the United States part of the Paris Climate Accord addressing climate change. Environmental protection, economic growth are not mutually exclusive. We should do everything possible to accomplish both. So there's a lot more that can be said, but I can tell you that I'm very excited about one other aspect, and that's battery technology. One of the companies is looking to invest, I think, hundreds of millions in Manatee County to build one of the largest batteries, frankly, in the world. It would be the largest battery. The idea that they've got solar capability, but solar is something that's got to be consumed quickly, and this will give them the capability to store that. And I'm very excited about where that technology is at, because I think we're at a point where there's a real opportunity to do something with battery technology as well. And I would support that for incentives. And that's Florida Power and Light. They're doing a lot in that space. So I think there's a lot of good things going on. Unfortunately, with this virus, everything's a little bit on the back burner, but I can tell you, for me, it's right at the top of the list, all these environmental issues that we've talked about. But I want to thank everybody for on the call today, and any input or thoughts that they have, they can get a hold of our office. We'd like to think we're at the forefront in terms of working on a bipartisan basis with other members of Congress. I always kind of view myself as more of a statesman. I've tried to find ways we can work together to make a difference and make this country even more special, and that starts with the environment. But thanks for the opportunity, and look forward to working with you on a lot of these different things in the near future.
Thanks, Congressman. I know you've got another appointment, but do you have a moment for a question or two?
Sure.
All right. So again, just for those that may be joining, please feel free to submit questions through the Q&A feature on your webinar for Congressman Buchanan. So we have one here that says, "Thank you for all your work on environmental issues, Congressman. As scientists and Florida residents, we truly appreciate your support in Congress." So it's not really a question, but worth reading. Here's another. "So unfortunately, COVID-19 has hit vulnerable communities the hardest from both a health and economic perspective. As Congress makes plans to rebuild the economy, how will you ensure more people listen to experts and make the world healthier for Florida families in terms of things like clean air and water and reducing climate pollution?"
Yeah, I think the priority with the virus is keeping people safe and healthy. That's my main focus. But the other side of the coin is we have to slowly, where it makes sense, and we do it safely, start rolling the economy back out. And I think a lot of communities are different. I mean, if you might look at New York or Miami, they might have, their challenge might be more intense, and that might have to take a little bit more time. But I think we can clearly look at different regions throughout the country. I think there's 20 states where they have a minimal virus problem. And so I think there might be some opportunities there. But we all need to work together, Democrats and Republicans at the national, state, and local level, and decide a lot of these things. And so that's the mindset I bring to it. I'm working closely with Democrats and Republicans. I co-chair the Florida delegation. Elsie Hastings is maybe viewed as one of the more liberal members of Congress. This is something we're talking about and trying to bring our delegation together and work on this together. And that's the mindset going forward. We've got to keep people safe, healthy, but at the same time, we have to start to, where it makes sense, roll out the economy in certain different areas throughout the country, and maybe different regions in various states.
Great, thank you. Let's see, got another comment from Peter that just says, "Thank you for your time and joining us. We appreciate you supporting Floridians and our environment." And then another question from Jason. "With all the scientific evidence that exists on global warming and climate change, why do you think there still remains folks that are harder to sell on making real progress?"
Personally, I see a lot of that changing in Congress where people are more open-minded. The science is pretty clear. So I feel optimistic going forward. I know more members on our side of the aisle are more open-minded in terms of all the environmental issues. So I think it's something that's very clear, a good environment in terms of clean water and a lot of things we're talking about air is good business, especially in a state like Florida. I chaired the Chamber of Commerce here for 2 years. We had a saying, good life, good business. Good life to me meant a good environment. And I think you can do those together. But again, thanks for the opportunity. Any of your viewers, if they've got any questions for our office or anything, they can go to buchanan.house.com. We'll be glad to work with them, take any of their thoughts and ideas. We don't have all the best ideas, but as I tell people, I'm humbled to be a member of Congress. But at the end of the day, I'm a representative, so we want to get your thoughts and ideas and make the planet a better place. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you again, Congressman, for joining us. All right. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Corey Schroed is currently serving as the Legislative Director for Congressman Francis Rooney. Representative Rooney is a member of the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus and is a leader who understands the importance, of protecting the environment to protect our economy. Welcome, Corey, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Dawn. It's a pleasure to be here and to join you and the rest of the folks on the panel. Certainly appreciate the comments by Congressman Buchanan. He's been one of our biggest partners in addressing environmental challenges, whether it's the Everglades, whether it's offshore drilling in the Eastern Gulf. We have no greater partner in that, in those endeavors. So Congressman Rooney is very passionate about this. He came to Congress just a few short years ago and immediately took a look at what the Republican Party was doing, what they've done in the past, and in the near history, it's been a little difficult. But if you look at the overarching themes, Nathaniel Reed and the Big Cypress Swamp, President Nixon putting together the EPA Clean Air Act, expansion under President Bush of Clean Air Act. These are the sorts of things that we can look back on and realize that you can be a good steward of the environment while also being supportive of economic development and making sure that the economy and jobs are continuing to thrive and expand. We look to strike that balance in everything that we work on in our office, whether it is Everglades funding. Our biggest industry in our district and a lot of districts across Florida is tourism. People don't come to Florida to see oil rigs. They don't come to Florida to see industrial development. They come to see what we have to offer on the coasts and the Everglades. They're absolutely incredible. And so our work to restore that really lines up with our own economic development and livelihood. We're fortunate enough to have good partners in our local colleges and with the state colleges, state universities, that we partner with them on a lot of things to look at data points, look at their research, and use those points to help guide our policy. There's often a balance that has to be struck between the art of the possible and the art of what we can do in this Congress. Mr. Rooney has been a big champion of carbon tax and looking at ways for deep decarbonization. And as we invite more members of our party into the conversation, we're looking to expand what issues they talk about. So while a lot of our colleagues aren't quite to a carbon tax, there certainly are a lot of folks that are talking more about innovation, about decarbonization. One of the more incredible things you're seeing with the virus issues is some of the clean air reports from India, from China, from even here in the U.S. The clean air, the clean water reports that you're seeing, I think it's eye-opening to a lot of folks. Certainly we don't celebrate any lost jobs, but the downturn in oil production, the Wall Street Journal just this morning had a report out about the shutting down of platforms and the shutting down of production in the Gulf of Mexico. We continue to look at how to extend the existing moratorium. And we look at this as an opportunity to have a conversation about where the industry is going and what the utility is moving forward as we do convert more to renewable energy resources and other alternatives, and how do we protect our natural coastline and natural treasures.
Great, thanks, Corey. So we've already got a couple questions in. Again, folks, I am encouraging folks to submit all of your questions to the Q&A feature at the bottom of the page. Let's go ahead with the first one. Let's see. Okay, I want to first thank you and Congressman Rooney's office for work thus far on both COVID-19 and climate change. The crisis we're in has been made much worse because some failed to listen to the warning of scientists. What is your office doing to make sure that COVID legislation packages include climate-friendly provisions and can support clean energy jobs?
Sure. I think so far you've seen a lot of the response being, how do we deal with the crisis immediately at hand? How do we deal with healthcare workers? How do we keep people being able to pay rent, pay their bills, that sort of thing? As we look at the next round of relief, there's a lot of discussion about some sort of stimulus, some sort of transportation related measures. And we think that that's a fantastic opportunity to introduce more natural resiliency infrastructure projects, things like the Everglades restoration. It's really easy for us to point to where the concrete goes in and helps move the water where it needs to be, but it's also a lot about natural resources and building up those natural projects along the coastline, natural barriers to ward off sea level rise, that sort of thing. So certainly we will be working with the committees moving forward as a fourth round of COVID relief comes forward.
Okay, great. See, I got another question here. Okay, so it says, thank you for your time, Mr. Schroet. We appreciate your support as well as Congressman Rooney's support for climate change efforts. What is your view on how we can further push HB 763 and gain more Republican co-sponsors? Do you think gaining more right-leaning co-sponsors would help make this bill successful?
I think, so Congressman Rooney's philosophy on this, 763, for those who don't know, is the carbon tax bill that rebates the carbon tax money back to citizens. So complete refunding of, complete rebate of the incoming taxes. It's a very unique and very great idea. Congressman Rooney's position has been one of we should be at a point where we should be in agreement on we need a tax. We need some kind of downward pressure for decarbonization. The other side of the equation is what we should be having a conversation about. The rebate model is fantastic. It has a lot of support in the Senate. It has significant support in the House. There are some other models out there. We actually have another bill that would reduce the payroll tax. There's another bill out there that would fund infrastructure projects. Some very unique ideas. So what we've done is try and take the conversation to our colleagues and make it one about here's where we need to go. Here's what the science says. Here's how we can get there without massively disrupting the economy. And certainly a carbon tax is going to have an impact on what the economy looks like, but there are certain ways to do it where it has far less of an impact in relation to some of the more command and control and heavy regulation options might. And we also use it as a carrot of, or maybe a stick. If you don't look for something like this, like a carbon tax, like HR 763, you're going to wind up with something with the green, more like the Green New Deal, and that is, as Republicans, that's a little difficult for us to wrap our minds around the entirety of it. The goal of reducing carbon emissions is fantastic. It's wonderful. We're 100% in agreement. But some of the other more broad economy changing schemes, that's going to be tough for any Republican to wrap their arms around. So we kind of pit it as you have a couple of different options. Here's the one that we think it makes the most sense from the least amount of economic intervention in a way that actually has significant changes in decarbonization.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Corey. I know we are trying to stay on time here, but it's very, very helpful, and I'm sure we'll be able to shoot you some more questions following the webinar that we weren't able to get to. So thank you. Well, next I'd like to invite Dr. Mark Luther to share with us. So Dr. Luther is Director of Ocean Monitoring and Prediction Lab at the University of South Florida's College of Marine Science, where he co-directs coastal ocean monitoring and prediction systems. His research looks at the effects of sea level rise and increased storm intensity and storm surge on infrastructure, particularly on wastewater and maritime ports and harbors. Dr. Luther, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, as Dawn just said, my research focuses on the interactions between built infrastructure, primarily maritime transportation, ports and harbors, bringing ships safely in and out of the harbor, and things like wastewater systems. As you know, we've had some issues in Tampa Bay with wastewater spills in the past few years that are directly related to increases in what we call compound flooding events, where you get lots of rainfall combined with increased storm surge, so that all that rainfall has no place to go. It floods the streets and saturates the ground. And because of our aging wastewater infrastructure, all of that rainwater and storm surge water infiltrates the sewer lines, causes overflows at the wastewater treatment plants, or overwhelms the wastewater treatment plants. And you get releases, typically intentional releases, to keep the sewage from backing up into people's homes, and that causes problems. Recent studies have shown that these sorts of things are increasing. It's kind of personal to me because I live right on the edge of Tampa Bay. As we know, Tampa Bay and Sarasota Bay as well are two of the most vulnerable areas to sea level rise and increased storm surge and things like that. The street in front of my house floods much more frequently now than it used to. In fact, just about every high tide now we get water backing up through the storm drains and into the street. So it's kind of personal for me as well. I've lived in this house for 28 years now, and so I've noticed an anecdotal increase in sea level rise. I also maintain all of the NOAA tide gauges around Tampa Bay. So I actually have some hard scientific evidence that this is indeed increasing. In fact, if I could just show a couple of graphics here, This is a study that we're working on with the Tampa Bay Estuary Program and the Tampa Bay Estuary Restoration Fund, TBERF, looking at the probability of these sanitary sewer overflows with increasing sea level. So the horizontal axis is sea level rise at different rates in meters from 0 up to half a meter, which was within the range of the various sea level rise prediction scenarios. And the vertical axis is the number of event days where you might have one of these wastewater overflows if nothing else were to change, if we weren't to improve the wastewater infrastructure. And as you can see, as you get up to half a meter sea level rise, you can get one of these things almost every day if nothing were done. So those are the sorts of things that we're trying to simulate based on past statistics and future projections to help guide municipalities in investment in improving this wastewater infrastructure so that we can flatten that curve. The other thing that we're working on is how ports and harbors function and how sea level rise might impact that. This is a nautical chart of Tampa Bay. The thin blue line is the main ship channel going into the various port facilities that are distributed around the bay. Tampa Bay is the largest port in Florida. Well over half of all of the petroleum product that comes into the state of Florida comes through Tampa Bay. And there's increasing container traffic, bigger and bigger ships that require more water depth to safely get through. And there are lots of twists and turns in the ship channel, many of which go across the main currents as the tides come in and out. And so these ship movements are restricted by the height of the tide and the strength of those currents moving in and out. Some simulations that we've done under future sea level rise scenarios show that the length of time that the tide is going to be high enough and that the currents are going to be low enough for ships to make some of these movements is actually going to change with future sea level rise. And in many cases, it's actually going to get longer. There's going to be longer intervals that the tide is high enough and the currents are weak enough for ships to get in and out. But at the same time, if the tide's higher, then there's less room underneath the Skyway Bridge for some of these larger ships to get under. Higher tides and higher storm surges in particular threaten a lot of the port infrastructure. So we're helping the Port of Tampa and some of the other port authorities around the bay to factor that into their infrastructure improvements and their future comprehensive plans and management plans, those sorts of things. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks. As a reminder, folks, please submit your questions through the Q&A feature. So we have a couple already. The first is, thank you, Dr. Luther, for your time and insight into climate change and sea level rise in Tampa Bay. We are proud to have you at USF and in the Tampa Bay community. Given all the wastewater dumping incidents and lack of development of a wastewater infrastructure in St. Petersburg, what do you think the city of St. Pete's next step should be to stop the wastewater issue from becoming a bigger problem than it already is?
The biggest thing that the city of St. Pete and Pinellas County can do is to invest more in wastewater infrastructure, particularly the laterals, they call them, the lines that run under the streets. Many of them are 50 years old or older. They're cracked. There's roots growing through them. I know the city of St. Petersburg is investing a lot of money right now in lining a lot of those sewer lines. It's very difficult to dig them up, but they can put basically plastic liners around the inside of them. You might see that around some of the streets in St. Pete. But that's the primary thing. And again, by using data on past spills and future sea level rise, we hope to help them prioritize where to spend that money on that infrastructure.
And we've got another question in a similar vein about your top recommendations for infrastructure changes that really should be pursued across Florida, given sea level rise and climate change. But I think specifically they're asking if there are any locations in Florida that you see as really taking the lead and doing what's needed.
Certainly the South Florida municipalities have really taken the lead with their regional climate compact. Miami and Fort Lauderdale have been very aggressively raising streets, improving drainage and those sorts of things. And just recently, the municipalities and counties around Tampa Bay have formed a similar climate change compact to do the same sorts of things around Tampa Bay. So again, the Tampa Bay and the Miami area seem to be leading the state in that vein.
Great. Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Luther, for your time today.
Thank you.
So next I'd like to welcome Captain Casey Streeter, who is the co-owner of Island Fish Market in Matlaka, who formed the Florida Commercial Watermen's Conservation Group following a series of algal events. And he's here to talk to us today about what he has seen in a changing climate and how it impacts the bottom line of his industry and what he's doing about it. Welcome, Casey.
No, thank you. I'm grateful to be here. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with you guys today. Obviously, being a commercial fisherman and an offshore charter captain, we're on the water. We see these things. We see changes in our ecosystems. We see influencers from land and other things that a lot of science groups aren't really sure about. So, we want to be out there. As Don had mentioned, I started Florida Commercial Watermen's Conservation to help our science community better understand red tide events and how they were affecting our fishery, our local economy, our blue economy here in Southwest Florida. We're actually just starting in the process of partnering with GCUS, where they will be storing our information that we gather offshore to get to all of our science communities. I mean, sea level rise, being a coastal community, is a very scary concept for us. My fish house is on the water. My house is on the water. And to deny these things that they're happening, I mean, would be crazy. Obviously, we need a healthy ecosystem. We need tourism. We need things to support our industry. And as sea level rise and changes happen in our environment, they're going to impact our industry, our seafood industry here in Florida, especially, which has seen a lot of challenges, whether it's the COVID-19 or the red tide events. We've had several strikes against us, and I don't want to see us go down this road. Our industry needs a healthy economy, and that'll definitely impact us down the road.
All right, great. Well, thank you. It's certainly an important perspective as a business owner and and fisherman. It's a huge industry in Florida. Folks have any questions for Captain Streeter, please go ahead and submit them through Q&A. And I will sort of, while we're waiting for the first one to pop up, I think from your vantage point as a business owner, how do you encourage folks to be able to use their voice to be part of a movement?
Well, I mean, with this and moving forward, I mean, look, our ecosystem and the health of our world is, I mean, these are purple issues. I mean, they're not really a red or blue or issue. They're issues that affect everybody. And collectively, we need to push forward to support science, to support collaborative research, to help support our science groups so we can make good decisions as coastal communities and as citizens moving forward.
Oh, got a couple coming in quickly here. So the first one is, what types of changes have you seen out on the water, and do you have specific recommendations to address those problems?
Well, I mean, the impacts that we've seen recently in our fishery come from red tide and poor water quality, obviously. So, I mean, from the event that lasted 2 years offshore, we had the red tide, we had hypoxic zones, we had a dead zone that had formed. It really changed our fishing practices. I will say that our water looks really great right now, and we are actively testing out there. Obviously from COVID-19, a lot of the federal NOAA programs have been put on pause. It's the same with the state. So our fishermen are working extra hard right now to be offshore testing because there's not much information being gathered. And right now when our water's in good shape, we want to test it. We want to see these changes if they happen so we can try to trace them back and figure out why they're happening.
That's great. It's another question from Marcy is, what do you think the most important thing is for communicating science with business owners and other citizens?
I mean, they're all in hand. I mean, our science groups are our most valuable asset to understanding these issues. And my community saw firsthand what poor water quality does to that economy, how it affects your business, how it affects tourism here in Florida. And that's really what motivated our community to get on board. We said, well, what can we do as a community to protect our most valuable resource? We can go out there and test, and we can give our science communities information that they hadn't had access to before. And when we started this program, we envisioned all of our coastal communities in Florida having some sort of program set up to where they could help science understand the issues that plague them. I mean, Southwest Florida is not immune, or the only community that has these issues. No one's immune to them. So it's better to test water when it's good to understand your problems you might have down the road.
And let's see, we've got one more here. So the question is, what do you see as the biggest sources of red tide? Agricultural runoff, sewage dumping, or another source? And what can be done to stop the problem of red tide and keep water at its current healthy state?
I think that's $1 million question. Look, we haven't had much runoff and our water looks great right now. And I mean, my big thing was, I think there's a lot of things that influence our red tide. I think it's a multi-headed monster, and the point of being out there to test and to identify these issues was our main goal from the beginning. So what's causing it? I'm not really sure, but what can I do to help understanding be brought forth? It's through grabbing this information. I mean, we test shallow, we test deep, and we love our science community to step up and figure these problems out for us because we're in dire need of it.
Great, thank you, Captain.
Thank you.
So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Matt McCarthy, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of South Florida's College of Marine Science. He grew up in Gainesville, spending many of his early years fishing, sailing, and hiking along both the Gulf and Atlantic coasts. And now he focuses on using satellite imagery to study those coastal areas and better understand how human impacts and a changing climate are affecting red tides, coastal habitats, and water quality. Thank you, Dr. McCarthy.
Thanks, Dawn. So far we've been kind of talking about a lot of the issues facing Florida in sort of an abstract or perhaps what is going to happen in the future. And I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk a bit about my research and show some figures. So I'll be switching to share my screen in a moment to see what's actually going on right now in Florida. So as Dawn mentioned, I grew up in Gainesville, right in the middle of North Florida, and I actually owe my early interest in marine science to my father. My father's not a scientist, but he loves fishing and sailing. And so he took me fishing on both Atlantic and Gulf coasts about as often as we could go. He even published this article about getting kids interested in fishing in a statewide magazine a few years back, displaying pictures of my siblings and me, and for some reason included this picture of me looking absolutely terrified of the first fish I ever caught. But I managed to get past that near-death experience, and I developed a fascination with sharks. And that led me to biology and scuba diving, which led to pursuing master's and doctoral degrees in marine science. Now, for both of those degrees, I conducted research into coastal erosion, sea level rise, water quality issues, and climate change. And the way that I connected those issues was with satellite imagery. You see, with a bird's eye view, we can see changes happening along our coast going back several decades to today. And for someone like me who grew up along Florida's coast, keeping an eye on the health and status of our unique coastline is both a privilege and a passion. So with that in mind, I want to show you the results of some of the work regarding the issue that concerns me the most, which is rising seas. Now, we know that the ocean is rising and that Florida's low-lying coasts are particularly vulnerable. We also know from tide gauge stations along the coast, the speed of that rising water is getting faster and faster. So here's a graph of Cedar Key sea level from 1939 to 2017. And what you'll see is that if we look at the long-term record, we have a rise of about 2 millimeters per year. But that's from 1939. If we limit that to 2000 to 2017, we see a rate of about 9 millimeters per year, so it's accelerating. And if we look from 2010, we have 12 millimeters per year. So that rate is getting faster and faster as we go along. What we don't know is when we will start seeing the more extreme effects along our beaches and in our backyards. The satellite images can't predict the future, but they can show us what's going on right now. But to see what rising seas are doing right now, we have to look at places in Florida that aren't subject to development, beach renourishment, seawalls, and other factors that mask the effects that we otherwise could see right now. And it just so happens that Florida's Big Bend, from just north of Tampa Bay to the Panhandle, is the country's longest undeveloped stretch of coastline. Now, there are, of course, some small towns dotting this region. I spent much of my youth fishing out of Cedar Key and Steenhatchee, but the majority of the region is largely untouched by direct human influence. So with that in mind, I analyzed changes along this coast using a series of very high-quality satellite images that are so advanced they can identify things as small as a car or a tree from space. The first study was published in 2018 and showing that sea level rise was killing off trees in a small study area along the Chassahowitzka River near Crystal River. And you can see with your own eyes that the trees along this river have been steadily dying off farther and farther from the river. So these photos you see now are taken from an airplane, and they're showing images captured in 2006, 2010, 11, and 14. And you can see back in 2006, we had this lush green thick forest right along the river. In 2010, you start to see some graying in those trees. In 2011, they're starting to die and fall. In 2014, we've lost so many trees and so much canopy that you can actually see the ground beneath the forest. The reason is because as the Gulf of Mexico waters rise, they both flood the low-lying coasts and bring salty water into river areas that are typically more fresh. So the combination of that soggy and salty water kills trees quickly, creating what's called ghost forests, where healthy forests once stood. Last year, we expanded this study to the entire Big Bend coast and found that the same pattern of coastal forest die-off is happening virtually everywhere, shown here with forest die-off highlighted in red. Not only that, but it's happening faster than predicted. So previous studies of the same phenomenon found rates of this inland moving forest die-off of about half a square mile per year during the whole 20th century from 1900 to 2000. Our study found that from 2003 to 2016, that rate accelerated to almost 4 square miles per year, which is about 8 times faster. Now, there are a lot of reasons this matters. Forest die-off means irreversible loss of habitat and loss of biodiversity, as Frank will probably talk about next. But it also threatens our coastal cities, economies, and our way of life. The changes we see right up the coast from us in this undeveloped area are the canary in the coal mine, showing us what's coming for our backyards in Tampa Bay, Sarasota Bay, and other places in a way that we can actually see them right now. Now, the good news is that it's not too late. There are a lot of things we can do in the short term and the long term to protect our coasts, but we need to act now to fix the root before it starts leaking. Now, I'll end by sharing some good personal news with you. My wife is pregnant right now with our first child, a boy, due in July, and we couldn't be more excited. And in spite of the concerns that I have about Florida's health, I'm also hopeful that we will make the changes needed to save our coast. And I look forward to taking him out fishing along our beautiful waterways for many years to come. And so with that, I'll be happy to take any questions that you all may have.
Thank you, and congratulations. It's an exciting time. We're excited for you. Well, folks, go ahead and submit your questions. First one's already in. So given what you've learned, what are your top recommendations for what should be done now to respond to sea level rise and prevent further damage?
Right, so there are, as I mentioned, there's some short-term and some long-term things. And Congressman Buchanan mentioned some possible options earlier, as well as Corey. We could address the long-term problems through carbon taxes to help reduce emissions. In the short term, it's probably really important for us to try and focus on our infrastructure. Mark mentioned the kind of flooding that we get when we have rainfall and storm surge, which is going to happen really right now. It kind of already is happening. So you see places like Miami that are raising their roads and trying to address their underground infrastructure to kind of firm those up, in a sense, to sort of give us more time, to buy a bit more time so that we can help mitigate the larger, longer term effects. So I would say focusing on infrastructure, investing what we can right now to help make sure that the people who live along our coast, including me, who lives in Manatee County, one of the most vulnerable counties in the country, are able to still maintain our lifestyles while planning ahead for the future and trying to make bigger decisions down the road.
Great, thanks. And the next question is, says, thank you for your time. Are you seeing any dominating species such as mangroves in those areas that are being affected by sea level rise?
Yeah, so actually mangroves are not very abundant in this area, in that Big Bend region of Florida. They're naturally occurring more to the south, although they actually are migrating northward because winter temperatures are getting warmer. So usually what happens with mangroves is that if we get a winter freeze, that freeze will kill off any mangroves, so there's a northern limit to their range. Right now, those mangroves are moving farther north, but what we're actually seeing in this area of the Big Bend primarily is trees like the sable palm, which is Florida's state tree. Those are seeing the greatest brunt of these die-offs because they are somewhat vulnerable to salinity and they're also somewhat vulnerable to wetter soil. So it's sable palm is the primary issue that we're seeing, the primary die-off that we're seeing.
Okay. Well, thank you. That was very helpful. Again, congratulations.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So now I'd introduce Dr. Frank Muller-Carter, who is a biological oceanographer and professor at the College of Marine Science at the University of South Florida, who has served as an appointee of President Bush on the U.S. Commission on Oceans Policy and is currently working with NASA, NOAA, and other governmental and non-governmental organizations to advance technologies to observe life in the sea. Muller-Carter researches how the range and distribution of species is changing with severe weather, climate, and management practice, because so many of our health and economic aspects of our lives depend on marine biodiversity. Dr. Muller-Carter, please tell us more.
Thank you, Dawn, and thanks everybody. This is a great opportunity to talk about what we do in our science labs. So today's theme for Earth Day is climate action. And what I would ask everybody to think about is what can you do to learn about these changes that we're going through. And it's not just sea level change or how CO2 is rising in the atmosphere. There's a whole lot of changes. And the amount of information that there is out there today that is easily available through the internet is just unbelievable. So this is, there's no question that things are changing, and they're changing in a number of parameters. And maybe I can tell you a little bit about how I got involved in measuring some of these changes. So the concern, of course, now is we have this pandemic with COVID-19, and yet there's an enormous amount of things that are happening around us that are changing how we live on this planet. It's not just us developing and trying to make a living, but how other things that live on this planet are to be sustained, because we depend so much on them. So there's no question that we depend on life. I think Captain Streeter explained it very clearly. I mean, we depend on organisms as small as phytoplankton, and they are the causes of red tide, and that affects a whole chain of things that ends up affecting livelihoods to fishing. So there's a connection between everything that we do. So I grew up looking at how the ocean where I was growing up was changing right in front of my eyes. I learned to fish just like Matt, fish from a very early age, but I also watched programs like Sea Hunt and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And I was curious about how life was distributed, how it was. And it was clear to me that things moved around, fish moved around. There are different areas where you had coral reefs, other places where you didn't. And so the question was, why do you have that? I did my master's in Alaska, where I went out on ships to the ice edge, where the polar ice cap kind of finishes. And it was clear to me that from a ship, I couldn't see beyond the ship. The ship stops, we took samples, then we moved a little bit, we collected another sample, and I was supposed to make a whole picture of the Bering Sea just by moving around at less than 10 miles an hour and stopping around. And clearly things were moving around us, the ice was moving, wind was blowing things around. So it was clear to me that I wasn't seeing the whole picture. So I had a chance to go to Maryland, to the University of Maryland, and work at the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center for my doctorate, where I learned that this was in the mid-1980s, we were already launching satellites and putting cameras on satellites to look at things from afar. And I learned that very quickly, even in the mid-1980s, we could already make pictures of the entire planet in things like that we were able to measure the color of the ocean, and with that we could say something about the vegetation that grows in the ocean, like phytoplankton. We could measure temperature, but we could also do things like measure sea level from space and around the whole planet. We could look at wave intensity, wind intensity, things that if you put them all together, you can say, well, the planet is changing in one way or another. And we have been making measurements like that systematically since the 1970s. So again, we measure color, temperature, salinity, winds, currents, waves, ice cover, the depth of the ocean, sea level, and we make, like Matt mentioned, we make measurements that can tell you something about wetland type and cover and coral reef cover. So now we have measurements like that for 30, nearly 40 years. And as we define what climate is, so we define weather as something very short, maybe a few hours to a few days, but climate is sort of the average of that over many years, 10 years to 30 plus years. And now we are starting to see climate in the measurements that we make, and we can see how temperature is changing. So it's very clear. We can see how even wind is changing, not only sea level rise, but how CO2 is changing. We can make all of these measurements from space. And one of the things that we're seeing is how biology is changing. So Matt mentioned how mangroves are starting to migrate. And you didn't think that mangroves are mobile, but they are moving. And so are fish, and so are crabs, and so are many other organisms that are changing their distribution, not only because sea level rise, but also because temperature changes or because the availability of food is changing. So these are real changes. We can measure them. We have been measuring them for a while. We have long enough time series to look at these changes. And what I ask again is I get online, learn about them, because you can see them and then see how we can all together figure solutions. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We've already got questions pouring in for you. So I think the first one is, what are the critical species here in Florida that you are most concerned with in terms of changing climate impacts?
Well, there's many. I think that our coastal vegetation is one, and we depend on the coastal vegetation for stability of the shorelines and so on. But in the water itself, there's a number of species that are being impacted. For example, coral reefs have been very clearly affected by the increases in temperature and the length of high temperatures during summers. And so we end up with bleaching and coral reef decrease. So many fish and many other organisms depend on wetlands and structures like coral reef to grow. So as we also have changes in climate, we have our own more direct actions in terms of agriculture or water management, and both Mark and Captain Streeter talked about this on how we affect the amount of water and nutrients that are being put into the ocean. So it's that interaction between our own short-term actions and the long-term changes in climate that make things very difficult for us to understand. But there's no question that coral reef. Fish are being affected. If you change the temperature, the fish are very temperature dependent, and so they follow different water temperatures as the seasons come and go. And people that fish and do tournaments know this very well. So there's different types of fish that come by our coast as the seasons change. As the seasons change in length and in temperature, those types of fish are going to change their migration pattern. So, and that's just a small example. There's many, many other organisms, from marine mammals to birds, that are changing their migration patterns. And, you know, mapping all of this is a big challenge, because basically we're just starting to really understand how these changes are happening.
Yeah. Well, we've got time for one more question for you, Doctor. As a scientist that understands climate change, both at the microscopic and the macroscopic view, do you think scientists should be serving in greater decision-making positions and advising policymakers at the federal and state level?
Yes. Very simple
That was
answer.
easy.
Absolutely, yeah. There's no question about it. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. And, you know, thank you again, Congressman Buchanan, and Legislative Director Corey Schroed from Congressman Rooney's office. Special thanks to the University of South Florida and all of our esteemed panelists today for sharing your stories and your expertise. We have learned so much over the last 50 years since the very first Earth Day, when literally rivers were on fire. But the most powerful lesson is that we can accomplish great things when we use sound science and work together. So thank you, attendees, all of you, for spending this last hour with us. Now more than ever, we need you to stand with us, even if we're standing 6 feet apart, to tackle the challenges of climate change. Wishing all of you and your families a safe and healthy Earth Day. Thanks for joining us. Have a great day, everybody.